Okay, let's get started, everybody. As usual, I've got probably 2 hours worth of material for 45 minutes, so we got to get moving. So this is a one-off. I think Chris is starting Romans next Sunday morning. So, and he just finished his last series. So I thought, well, I just need a one-off to fill the space here until he's back and ready to jump back into his next series of Romans. So this is a pretty interesting discussion that we'll have today. I called it Reframing Jesus, just thinking about him in a different perspective. But it's interesting to see how people view Jesus from around the world. They want to kind of make him look like their people, their culture, and have their feelings, their emotions, their temperaments. And so when you see different pictures from Jesus, that you've seen online or in picture books or whatever, you see these different emotions and you see how they look. But let's see if we can get it to go. Yeah. So, but you can see how he's frequently pictured in the same types of poses, but you can see how dramatically different he looks depending on what culture has, made the picture or whatnot. So it's kind of interesting to see that. Here's another one. Or what about this one? So sometimes clearly there's agendas involved with how they picture Jesus and so forth. But they were all asking really, who is Jesus? And that is the main question. Is he some kind of, composite or conglomeration of all of our ideas? Have we created him in our own image, or is it the opposite way? These are questions that are kind of worth asking. But we're all making assumptions here about how he looks. Each one of those pictures was an assumption by somebody. Where did those assumptions come from? Some of them come from the Bible, but there's many things that we know for sure that come from the Bible, especially from the gospel text, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But how do we know that that text is factual? How do we know that that text is authentic? I don't know if you've ever read much about the missionary, the Mormon missionaries and the text, that Joseph Smith wrote. He was told that an angel came to him, told him that there were gold plates buried in a certain place, and he showed him where the gold plates were. And there's also a silver bowl with 2 stones that were called seer stones, S-E-E-R. And so he dug up the plates and recognized that the language on the gold plates was a language that nobody knew how to speak, nobody knew how to translate. And so here's the way that, according to Joseph Smith even, that we received the Mormon missionary texts, is that he took like a white stovepipe hat. He put these seer stones, he put one seer stone in the bottom of the hat. He would put the hat up to his face, and every time he did that, no light would get in. It would just be dark inside the hat. And then the seer stone would give him the image of the first letter of the word on that golden plate. And then he had a friend of his who would then start transcribing. He was the scribe, and he would start writing the text. And then he would put the hat, and he said as soon as his friend would write down the letter, the image would disappear in the hat. And then the next image would appear, and he would tell his friend what the next letter for the word was. This is how we got the Mormon missionary text. And supposedly, they did this transcription over the course of like 82 days. Then he lost over 100 pages of the text, which is crazy. And then he took him about 5 years to retranscribe because there were no other copies of that original text. He had the only one. And then he had to recreate over 100 pages of it. And so, there's a problem with authenticity when we're not able to track the original document to what we've got now. That's really important for us to be able to do. There's a lot of other problems, by the way, with his transcription, which was done right in, first third of the 1800s. He said that what the information on those tablets, was from 2,000 years before the time of Christ, yet he quoted many chunks of the King James Bible. And there were a lot of words and phraseology that were in what he transcribed, supposedly, that were never used in language back in that, before Christ. And so it's like, well, how did you, and it's pretty funny because he addressed every controversial issue that they were having regarding religion in the 1800s was addressed in there. It's like, wow, that's convenient. Textual criticism, how did we get the document that we have? How do we have the New Testament text that we have? Tyler was working with a friend in Columbus, Mississippi, one of his pilot friends that was showing an interest in that was the guy's first question. He's just like, well, how do we know where these books of the New Testament came from? Like, why are these the books? Because there's other books, like the book of Barnabas, and why are these the canonized books? How did we come up with these? And how do we know that these are authentic, legitimate ones? And those are interesting questions, that we need to be able to answer to people. Otherwise, it's going to be a problem. So we believe that the Bible was inspired of God. What verse can you think of right off the top of your head where we get that from? That's right, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. All Scripture is inspired by God. The Greek literally means God breathed. So God, through the Holy Spirit, inspired certain individuals that he was willing to reveal his revelation to. And those people, put pen to papyrus or whatever, and that's, how we came with the written text. Now, what's interesting, that original, let's say, when Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthians, that original penning of the letter is called an autograph. An autograph. Do we have any of the original autographs from the Bible? Those original first penned letters. You don't think so? Those are copies. Yep. The answer is, he's right. We don't have any. 0 autographs. Does that bother you? That we don't have any of those original first documents?
Wish we did.
Yeah, it'd be nice. And from what I've read, the last mention of any of the originals was, by one of the early church fathers in like the late 300s was mentioning the existence of some of John's writings. And that's the last we really read about the existence of one of the autographs, actually. So it shouldn't bother you because really when we look at ancient literature, we don't have any of the original autographs of any of the people like Plato, Aristotle, Josephus, the Jewish historian, Caesar, Tacitus. All we have of all these people, it's just copies. We don't have it. And because the originals were so fragile that they would succumb to the environment and they would start falling apart, and they don't exist anymore. And I don't believe that we'll ever find them. I don't believe that they're buried someplace and we're going to dig them up. I just don't think that's going to happen.
If we did, they would immediately become idols of worship.
Right.
It would not be.
Right, they'd be venerated, right? Yeah. Now all of a sudden people would be migrating to... That's right. That's exactly right. I agree. Think about the Gettysburg Address. This is 1863, so we're only talking like 161 years ago. Do we have the original of Lincoln's address? The answer is no, we don't. We've got 5 copies. His secretary kept a copy, and there was a Navy historian that got a copy of it. But we do not believe, there's some disagreement, but we don't even believe from 161 years ago, from such an important speech that was delivered, the Gettysburg Address, we don't even have that original. We do have one original, though. Oh, no, I wanted to mention this first. I I talked to a guy who was, his PhD in documents and things, like his PhD is actually has to do with speeches and things like that. They let him into the Reagan Library to let him actually hold some of these older speeches. One of them was Reagan's speech here. This is at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin in Germany. And this is where he made that famous statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And what's interesting is that, his speechwriters kept on, they didn't want him to say that. So they kept on removing it, and he kept on handwriting it back into the speech. No, I want to say that. And he would handwrite it back in, and they would edit, he would make other edits, and they would give him the new version, and then they would take it out again. And that happened several times. So when he went to look, you could see that even in this speech, which was like 36 years ago, you can see there's several edits to it, and there were several versions of it just to this speech. So, but back to my point, we do have one document where we do have the autograph that is special to us, and that is the Constitution. And we have gone to such great lengths to protect this autograph. It is in temperature-controlled environment, humidity-controlled. It's between very thick, bulletproof glass. I think if we have a nuclear event here in the United States, this document may survive. They've gone to such great lengths to try and keep that. But think about that. It's amazing that we actually have the original of this. That was written in 1787. It was ratified the next year in 1788, and it's been in operation since 1789. So it's a document that's 235 years old now at this point, and we have managed to preserve that autograph, which is truly amazing. And it's in the rotunda for the Charters of Freedom in Washington, D.C., something that would be a fun trip to go see sometime. Okay, so what do we have? If we don't have the original autographs of the Bible, we have copied manuscripts, as we alluded to. Those were usually copied onto papyri. And the papyrus it was a plant, and it was something, the papyrus plant needed a lot of sun to grow. It needs either full or a lot of partial sun, but it also needs material, it needs soil that's wet, so it would grow, along riverbeds and things in Egypt, particularly, along the Nile and things. It was a plant that was pretty hardy that would grow and give them a substrate onto which to write or copy some of these ancient manuscripts. So here's an example. This is it's called Papyrus 46. All of these ancient manuscripts that we have found, they have cataloged, and they've given them a number so that when they're discussed in writings, by academics and so forth, they can refer to Papyrus 46, and everybody knows kind of where it was found. Oh, Papyrus 46, that's right. So this is the Papyrus 46 is the oldest manuscript that we have from Paul, from the writings of Paul, is in Papyrus 46, and it's actually in the Chester Beatty Library. Chester Beatty was a guy who was just a collector of ancient manuscripts, and he happened to acquire this. It's in Dublin, Ireland. But I wanted to show you how papyri is made, how the papyrus paper is made. Here's the papyrus plant. Sorry, there's the manuscript. That's Papyrus 46. And you can see the date. It says AD 180 to 200. That's when they've dated this document to, 180 to 200 AD. There's the papyrus plant, and here is how they make it, which is crazy. They get the stems of the plant, and they strip all the greenery off it, and then they start, with a sharp knife, they try and split those stems like this. So then you end up with a bunch of those, right? Then you crisscross them and overlap them, dry them, and you start ending up with something that is writable after it dries, after they press out all of the moisture from that and they let that dry together. It's pretty amazing.
Do they beat it to make it flat?
Yeah, they use different, rocks, and they would use rocks and different things to try and squeeze out all of the moisture from it and try and flatten it down to make it, as smooth of a writing surface as possible. Now, what would they write on it with? Sometimes I get nervous when I say, well, they used Paul put pen to paper. Well, he didn't really put pen to paper, but he did put pen to papyri when he wrote, but these are different types of pens, actually. A reed pen made from a reed. Bone, there's a bone stylus that's made from a bone. There's wood styluses. And then, of course, they would need like an inkwell. They didn't have like a Bic pen. Right, but they would dip the end of the stylus or the reed pen into the inkwell, and that would be how they would write. So, because these are some of the oldest manuscripts, in some instances we have just fragments of the copy. We don't have the entire copied document, but we have sections of it. So those would be fragments. And if you find a whole original document, that's an amazing find, right, for archaeologists. So, like, we found, an entire copy of the New Testament. That's rarely happens, but has happened. So we've got a lot of what we call fragments. And here is, for example, Papyrus 66. This is from the Gospel of John. This is circa AD 200. And this one is part of a collection. And here's what the collection of those papyri look like. You can see the different leaves of this papyrus paper there. This is a near complete copy of the Gospel of John, where there's 39 pages or pieces of papyri that have writing on both sides, the front and the back. And this particular one is a pretty small kind of codex of it. It's only about 5.5 inches by about 6 inches in size. So this is a pretty small one. Here is Papyrus 47. This is of the book of Revelation, written by John. This is circa AD 250. This is 2 of 10 pages that were found in this particular collection, and this is of Revelation chapters 9 through 17 that we have fragments of those chapters in this particular one. Here's Papyrus 75, and this is one of 50 pages in this collection. This is the Bodner collection, and this is much longer paper. This is 10 inches by about 5.5 inches wide, so it's kind of a narrow and long codice that was a collection of different pages. And it was named after Martin Bodmer. He's a Swiss collector of rare books and ancient manuscripts. This guy died in 1972 at about age 70. So when I was 2 years old, this guy passed away, but he was the one who had this in his collection. And look at the time frame, AD 200 on this. And what's really significant about this is Papyrus 75, and I'm going to show you a close-up of part of it. It shows the ending of the book of Luke and the beginning of the book of John. Check this out. So when you translate this Greek into the English, at the top half of that blue circle is the ending of Luke and the beginning part of the book of John. Why is that important? Why would that be important that we have ancient manuscripts that date back to circa 200 or earlier that show the transition between two books like that? What is that? And does anybody notice the congruency of that to our Bible today? So what's important is that we have manuscripts, fragments, and whole parts that show our modern day canon, the same books that were in our Bible, in the same order. We know the order. how do we get the order that we order the New Testament in today from these manuscripts that we found? We didn't just, well, let's just put the Gospels first and we'll put Revelation last. No, we found them compiled by church fathers way back when. This is the order that they had it in. These are the books that they had in there. This is how we came up in large part with the canon, was based on the manuscript evidence. So there's a chain of evidence from the autographs, the original, then we've got copies, whole copies, we've got fragments, and when we look at that compendium of evidence, that's how we came up with exactly what books we have in the New Testament in exactly the same order as the church fathers had them. Here's papyrus number 25. This is from Matthew chapter 19. This is a little bit older one. This was found in the 4th to 5th century. This would have dated back to the 4th or to the 5th century. This was only a single page, and there was nothing else found except that page. Here's a couple of other examples. Here's papyrus 28 and papyrus 37. You can see that one is from John 6, one is from Matthew 26. These are a little bit these were found a little bit, or dated to a little bit later. You can see there's holes in some of these spots, and how would we fill in those holes? How do we know what word was missing? Well, because we've got tons of other copies of the same thing, which makes it really easy to fill in the gaps. So both of these finds were just single pages. There wasn't anything else found. Sometimes they would not find it in sheets, but they would find it in rolls like this. And archaeologists would have to very carefully unroll these to try and preserve it and see exactly what was written on these things. And then eventually what happens is we will then, just like the Constitution that I showed you, in order to try and preserve it, they're going to have to put this between glass. They're going to have to climate control it. They're going to have to control the temperature. They're going to have to control the humidity. Otherwise, these things will continue to just fall apart, and they'll just be dust at some point if we don't try to preserve them. A lot of what we found have been found in the area of Egypt. A lot of them were found on this one island. It's called Elephantine Island, and this is a small island in the Nile. And it just so happens that the conditions were such that it preserved a lot of these for us, which is interesting. You don't hear, we always hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we don't hear about, finds, a lot of which were found in the Egyptian area because of the humidity and the heat that's there was in such a way that it would preserve it. These finds were found in the 5th century. These were some of the documents, some of the manuscripts that were found date back to 5th century BC. Those are really old manuscripts that were found there. That's pretty crazy. Here's a closer up of that island. Here's what that island looks like. Can you believe that they found documents dating back to 5th century BC here? Some of what they found from there is now in the Berlin Archaeological Museums, and you can see there it is, stored between the glass. Here's some more of the close-up of that. Another one. Now here's something that's very interesting to me. This is Papyrus 52. This is the oldest known fragment of a biblical manuscript that we found. It comes from the Gospel of John. It was discovered in Egypt, and it comes from the first half of the 2nd century. We're talking first half of the 100s AD. How old did John live to be? About 100. He probably lived to be about, he probably died circa 100 AD. And now we have documents that he penned. We have found them in the first half of the 2nd century AD. So, and actually, this probably dates to within 10 to 20 years, they think, of the life of John. That is unbelievable that we have found so many fragments and chunks of manuscripts that we actually have something written so close to the actual time when it was written. Maybe in a 20-year period from his lifetime, we have a document, a copy of what he wrote. That close is amazing. And I'll draw that out here in a little bit. Here's what it looks like. You know, they took the Greek text, and we're just looking at basically fragments. You know, what we have is the red letters in the Greek. And if I blow that up a little bit, here's the words that are in the red. This is what we have from that fragment. It's just what's in the red. But you can see it comes from John 18 and those verses 31 to 33, and you can just see how it fits in. I find this truly amazing. It is so valuable that it's kept in a climate-controlled case, and this is in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. And they believe it dates between 100 and 125 AD as far as when this was originally written. So we know that John was writing into the 90s AD and probably died around 100 AD, probably wrote the book of Revelation very late in his life. So writing within 1 or 2 decades of this, though, is unbelievable. This is Papyrus 46. It's Paul's letter to the Galatians. These pages are pretty good size, 11 by 6. And, if you take a close-in look, that rectangular box in the yellow, if we kind of zoom in on that, we can see that there's the top line and the brown strip there, and then there's the Greek where we've just had the Greek letters just so to make it easier to read, and then the second line, and we've transcribed that into the Greek letters, and you can see that says, Paul, an apostle, sent not from men nor by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father. We can see that exact translation from those 2 lines. So it kind of almost, the letters almost in the original Greek almost kind of run together, and if you'll notice later on when I show you some pictures shortly here, it's just one big block of text. There's no divisions between the verses, there's no paragraphs, it's just blocks and columns of text. But they've categorized all these. There's Papyrus 1 through Papyrus 24, and they've cataloged them all. We know exactly where each of them are stored, in what library or what private collection. Here's more of them. And there's a lot of these. So we've got papyri, are the oldest manuscripts. Then we need to talk about another category called the uncials. The uncials. And these are not as old as the papyri. If you found a manuscript that was written on papyri, that is ancient. That is really old. But now, not quite as old, but in many instances more well preserved, we have the uncials. And the uncials would be on parchment, or this would be like vellum. So this would be on animal hide, that they would make the copy and write the letters or the text. They would copy it onto animal skin, and they would turn that into vellum or parchment. And here's a modern day guy doing the same thing. So we can reproduce exactly how they were doing this, and we do today. People still kind of are experts in this. Kind of weird. And then they would make different sheets to that, and then they would bind them together, and those were much easier to bind together in like a codex or book, essentially. And so you can see how they would sew the binding of that together, not too much differently, than the way we would do it today. Here's somebody working on the binding of it here, on this kind of frame of wood. There's another picture. See, here's a modern day. Look how neat and clean that is. Much better than the papyri. Now they're done sewing that one up. So, complete books would be called codices or codexes. And here's one. This is the Codex Vaticanus. It's a complete Bible that was found on that vellum that we have. And this dates back to the mid-4th century. So between 3 and 400 AD, we have a complete codex of the Bible. This is in the Vatican Library. It's 10.5 by 12 inches, almost like a regular piece of paper size, a little bigger than a regular piece of paper size. This is the chief treasure in the Vatican Library. And they've had it since 1481 is when this was discovered, and they have been preserving it ever since. It's 759 leaves of vellum that are bound together. So this is a thick codex. Here's what it looks like, and this is what I'm saying when I say it's just in columns and it's just in blocks. So it was later translators that then had to break this up into textual breaks into the verses, and you can see somebody has handwritten numbers on this copy of the codex, the verse numbers, so that as they're looking at it and studying the Greek, they know what verse it corresponds to in our Bible, which is crazy. Here's a closer up. You can see the verse numbers that somebody's written in there. That was not there. That was not part of the original. Here is another codex. This was found a little bit more recently in the 5th century. This is the Codex Alexandrinus. This is in the British Museum. 773 vellum leaves. Here's how the pages in this one look. Here's a crazy story I want to tell you about. This is, and you probably have heard of this, the individual in this picture is Constantine Tischendorf. He was a collector of biblical manuscripts. He just loved to go find Bible manuscripts all over the world. He visited this monastery, which is St. Catherine's Monastery. This is at the base of Mount Sinai. And he did this in 1844. He took a visit because he heard that they had quite a collection of ancient manuscripts on papyri. So he took a trip with a group of people there, and they thought, they're going to afford him an opportunity to peruse through their scrolls and what they had in there. And they'd been there for quite some time looking through things, and one day he was in kind of a big open area that the monks used. They had a fireplace in there, and there was a basket of fire-starting material next to the fireplace. And he just kind of looked in the basket of fire starter material, and he reached in there and he pulled out what has become the oldest complete copy of the New and almost like 99% of the Old Testament that we have. These monks were burning these ancient manuscripts as fire starters. No telling what they had burned before he found this basket full of stuff. And so he pulls it out and starts leafing through it, and he recognizes what it is. He doesn't know exactly how old it is yet, but it doesn't take him very long to figure out, but he made a mistake. He made such a big deal about what he had found that the monks were like, well, wait a minute. It seems like this is maybe something valuable. And so they would not let him take it. And so he was beside himself. Over the next decade, he went back 2 more times, attempting to get them to give him that codex so that he could preserve it and they could study it. And he supposedly tried to go get permission from a Roman Catholic bishop, and he did get some permissions, but essentially the last time he went, he was trying to talk them again into giving him that codex. They were just like, they remembered him. They're like, no, we're not we're not stupid. We're not going to give it to you. We think this is probably something of value that we might be able to sell at some point. And on one of the last couple of nights he was there, one of the monks came in and handed it to him privately. And he said, "Can I go and look at this in my chambers for a while?" And the guy gave him permission to do that. Well, he just took it, and they left. And so you might say he stole it. But he did work with one of the Roman Catholic bishops to make copies of it. One of these copies, and now I can't remember if it was the original or if it was a copy of it, ended up in the hands of the Russians. We ended up having to reacquire it from the Russians. So this is a crazy, crazy story. But Tischendorf was really considered a world-leading Bible scholar in this time, which is just incredible. Here's another picture of that monastery. So what that turned out to be was the oldest Greek version of the Old Testament, and in addition, it dates back to a dating of about 325 AD is when this dates back to. So that is about the oldest copy that we have. It's called the Codex Sinaiticus, and they would name these frequently, according to where they were found. So we got the Codex Alexandrinus, found in Egypt, and so forth. So this is now in the British Museum. Each page is 15 inches by 13 inches. This is, very large vellum sheets here. And then here's kind of a close-up of some of the pages. So we've also categorized all of these various codexes or collections of vellum or parchment as well. So there's about 4 that are very old, but here's all of the ones we have. That shows who has control over them. Very interesting. There's a lot of them. Okay, so we've talked about the papyri, the really old ones. Then we talked about the uncials, where they would start putting them on the animal hides. Those are the uncials. They would start combining them together in the codices or codexes, like book form. Then, what are the minuscules? The minuscules are even come a little bit later. What do you notice immediately about the minuscules? What's on there that looks different? They've got color, and they've got these graphics and artistry that they've added to the minuscules. And so they try to beautify the pages. And so here's a page actually from the book of Psalms, and this dates back to the 12th century. So now this is not nearly as old, is it? Here's a sheet from Isaiah. This dates back to the 16th century. Here's minuscule number 7. This is from Paul's letters. This dates back to the 10th century. Minuscule 65, minuscule 104, just to give you an idea of what some of the artistry looks like on some of these. Look at some of that. Okay. So all those manuscripts form what we call, the textual history of the biblical documents. And all ancient literature has a textual history. And it's impressive to compare the textual history of the Bible with other ancient literature. And so what I want you to look at is a simple manuscript count on a bar graph that I'm going to have here. And it's going to show you the 8 most well-known ancient writings. How many ancient manuscripts of those do we have compared with the ancient volume of ancient manuscripts of the Bible? So Homer, we have 643 ancient copies of that. We don't have the autograph, right? Just like we don't have an autograph of any of the books of the Bible. Ancient manuscripts, 643 of Homer. Here's Herodotus. We've got 8. That's it. 8 copies of the original that existed. Here's Thucydides. 8. Here's Plato. 7. Demosthenes, 200. Caesar, 10 of the Gallic Wars. Only 10 copies of that. Livy, 19. Tacitus, 20. What about New Testament? 5,795 copies of the original autographs. That is amazing. How did that happen? How could that happen? Yeah, I mean, there's no other explanation except that God preserved it in such a large volume that there could be no doubt that when we would later do the study, as all of our academics have, to try and disprove the Bible, they couldn't. There was too many copies. Now here's something else I want to tell you about. These copies the most recent ones that we have of all of these ancient Greek writers, these are 1,000 to 1,400 years. The copies we found date back to 1,000 to 1,400 years after the original was written. Those are the earliest copies of those manuscripts that we can find. The Bible, copies are 15 to 225 years from the original writing. And we have the one fragment that's within 2 decades of John. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm thinking about what's valid and what's truthful, you want the original to be as close, you want the copy to be as original to the the copies to be as close to the original writing as possible to make sure it's not different, it hasn't varied, there's no error in it. That is truly amazing to think about this. You can even go by Plato, right? These books, these Greek secular writings by Plato and Caesar and Tacitus and all these other writers, these are taught in every university of liberal arts in our country. My kids read most of these books at Scottsdale Prep. They are taught as fact. There is no doubt as to the historicity of these documents. You can go buy them, collections of these, on Amazon today. Nobody doubts the historicity of these. Yet, they came from that long after. Amazing. But they will question the New Testament. So here we go. So God gave us the autographs. We have all these copied manuscripts. But beyond that, we also have other sources of what was in the Bible. And that was lectionaries and also writings, historical writings by the church fathers. Because when they would do a lectionary, somebody would teach a class or they would preach a sermon, they would frequently write on papyri or vellum what they were getting ready to preach or what they were getting ready to teach. So oftentimes we would find groupings of things by topic. And so, well, here's a collection of verses that all have to do with the topic of love. And then on that parchment or on that papyri, there would be a collection of verses. We can go back and put together an entire copy of the Bible just from what we have found in these lectionaries and historical writings by the church fathers, which is amazing. There was so much writing about the Bible way back in these ancient time periods that we could even piece it together without even having a copy of the original. Here's an example of a lectionary. This would be something that somebody had put together to teach a class from. And this has excerpts from the book of John, Matthew, and Luke all on one page. Here's another lectionary, lectionary 183. It's got John, Matthew, and Luke verses all on the one page. Lectionary 1686. This has different verses from the book of Acts and some of the general epistles that Paul had written to various churches. So another kind of quotation is the early church fathers. So we think about people like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, John Chrysostom, Tertullian, and so many more. There's about 220 actually quotations from church fathers that we have. And if you like, you can even purchase a volume set of all of the church fathers' writings that have been bound up in this collection right here. And so all of these men had a Bible, and there were so many quotes that they used that we could actually reproduce everything from there. Real quick, let's see if we can finish. We have different language versions of the minuscules. Some were in the Syriac language, some were in Coptic, some were in Latin. Here's an example of the Syriac, the Coptic, the Latin. Now, we take those copies and we have created printed Greek texts of those copies. And these are different individuals, such as Tischendorf, the guy that found in the basket of garbage in the monastery, the oldest known codex that we have. They have then converted, what they found into a printed Greek text. And then that gives us the Greek New Testament. And here's an example of some pages from like this Greek New Testament. Now it's starting to look like what we're used to seeing. Then from the Greek, we have to make the English translation. Here are the different various English translations going back to Tyndale, the first one in 1526. Many of these people like Tyndale gave their lives for doing this. And then if we had to look at a kind of a graph of which of these English translations is the most accurate, if you go over to the left, this is word-for-word translation. So the interlinear, which is very difficult to read from, but that is the most specific word-for-word translation. Then what's next? NASB. That's the closest, New American Standard Bible. That's what I use. Then you got the King James Version, then the New King James Version, Revised Standard Version. These are all very accurate ones, right? Look at where the NIV is. It's more of a thought-for-thought translation. It's not so much word for word. So if you want to have a more accurate English translation, you want to use a Bible from this end. Now, what are these down here? If you're using one of these, I don't know that I would do that. Maybe if you're just looking for a different wording, I don't know. But these are really just a paraphrase. They're really not very accurate. So TPT is the Passion Translation. TM is the Message Translation. The LB, which a lot of people use, is the Living Bible. GW, God's Word Translation. A lot of people use these, and just not very accurate. So you want to be towards the left. Look at that, see what version you're on. That's why I like to use the New American Standard. We made it. But I did want to leave us with just a couple questions of thought. Why have we so many more copies of the Bible than there are any other Greek texts? And then why has the document been so widely dispersed? And we can see that even from within 40 years of the writing of some of these, they were dispersed all over Egypt, because that's where some of these were found, dug up out of the desert somewhere in Egypt, dating back to then. So we know that they became quickly disseminated, widely dispersed, widely copied. how valuable our Bible is. You know, I know people that when they keep their Bible in their house, they refuse to stack anything on top of it because they have so much respect for God's inspired word that has come through us via an unbroken chain of evidence for all these thousands of years. And so they show respect by not ever placing another book or anything on top of their Bible. How seriously do we take the message of the Bible? When you're talking with people and their first question is, how do we know the Bible is true? I'm hoping you can remember a little bit of this lesson. We know with absolute certainty that the text we have today is the same as it was back then. Were there copying mistakes? Yes, but there's so many other copies that those errors can be fixed with ease, and the number of copying errors were really very few. In the Mormon missionaries, there have been over 100,000 errors and copying changes. The Bible has just a handful, but we have so many other copies and fragments. We know how to make those corrections, and none of them made any theological difference. That's what's important to know. All right, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Wanted to make a quick introduction of our speaker this morning. We have a guest speaker of sorts. Last week was Theo Jones's last week at North Valley. A pretty sad day to see Theo go. He's off to Chicago after being in the Valley here for 33 years. And if you missed the potluck that we had and kind of the send-off, I'm sorry that you had to miss seeing him off. He's been just such an integral part of the Valley for so many decades now. Thankfully, at North Valley, though, we have a deep bench. So it just so happens the first week he's gone, Chris has got things happening with family and cannot be here. And so luckily, we've got a fill-in here this morning, and it's Kyle Lockridge. Kyle Lockridge just graduated high school. He'll be a senior this next year at Yavapai Community College, and he'll be playing baseball up there. He's a pitcher. If you want his autograph, it'd be a good idea to get it now before he gets drafted. I'm his manager. You can pay me a few dollars. I'll get you access. But we have a rich history at North Valley of bringing up young men that are very capable in preaching the word. We have several young men that are in college or just out of college that could easily step into the role as a full-time pulpit minister because their Bible knowledge is so rich and so deep. And because we have such a small congregation, they've been given the opportunity to teach and to preach, which you don't usually see in a large congregation. So we have a very unique situation here at North Valley where we have produced a lot of young men very capable, and Kyle is going to be the next. I've studied with Kyle. I've had Kyle up at my summer camps at Copper Basin Bible Camp. He is one of the boys that is really seeking truth and has put a lot of time and effort into studying, not just this week, but over a long period of time. And it's always interesting to see what these young men want to speak about, what they want to talk about, what's on their mind, what they've been meditating on. So with that, I give you Kyle Lockridge.
Get this straightened out first. Thank you, Alex. Chris asked me a couple weeks ago if I would like to lead a sermon on Sunday morning or Sunday night on the 21st, which it's the 21st, I think. And so naturally I said, let's do Sunday morning. And so early this morning I started planning my lesson, and I'm just kidding. It was really late last night. I've been meditating a lot on the disciplines that a Christian needs to have individually in their faith. And as I'm going out to college, it's been hitting me that I'm going to be alone. I'm going to be responsible for my own growth in the faith. No one else is going to hold me accountable. It's going to be me and God. It's going to be myself that is responsible for maintaining my faith. And so, naturally, from the point of an athlete, I'm going to draw a few similarities, as Paul does from 1 Corinthians 9 this morning. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize, he says. Run in such a way that you may win. Basically, if you don't play to win, don't play at all. And that's Tom Brady, the best quarterback in NFL history right there. Athletes train to win. They discipline their bodies. They regiment themselves. They diet. They go through strict, strenuous workouts and long nights of rest to whip their body into the best possible shape, into peak condition for whatever they're competing in. 23-time Olympic gold medalist Michael Phelps said this, and I actually have a slide for this, so. He said this, I write my goals down on a piece of paper, and they're there where I can see them because I have to have a reason. I have to see something for why I am getting up in the morning and what I'm doing that day. And he goes on to tell reporters this. He says, you're laying a foundation to give yourself the opportunity to build a house. So it's always remembering that those little small steps can add up to massive things. Like him, Eliud Kipchoge, marathon runner who won Olympic gold in 2016 and 2020, lived and has trained basically in what we would consider a minimalist camp for the past 19 years, and this is it. This is where he trains. It's in a small town in Kaptagat, Kenya, and he shares a room. He shares a twin bed with one of his training partners in one small room, and this is how they train. Running on the dirt roads of Kenya, and he won Olympic gold. He was asked in an interview why he trains in such a minimalist camp. He has opportunity, he has contracts, he has the ability to have the best training conditions in the world. And he said this, he said, it's free from distractions. When they asked his coach what he had to say about his immersive style of training, the guy said, this guy is so positive and really focused. The two things he said is he's positive and he's focused. And that was the head of his 2019 race in Vienna when he became the first human to run a sub 2-hour marathon. So there's something to that. This high quality picture here is from the 2005 strongman competition. And this guy's name is Mariusz Pudzianowski. He was the 5-time world strongman. And yes, this is him lifting 2 refrigerators over his back, which I just found out that's an event they do in the strongman competition because why not? His method of success, he said to reporters, begins at breakfast. He would eat 10 eggs and 2 to 3 pounds of bacon in the morning, which is impressive. I mean, that's something. That's one way to start your day. That's a breakfast right there. So these athletes, their lifestyles are focused, intentional, and consistent. And that requires immense discipline. I'm going to read the scripture again just for the sake of repetition and for the sake of really hammering home what Paul is trying to say here. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. So what's Paul telling us here? He's saying we need self-control and we need to set our aim. And we'll come back to the self-control point, but let's delve into this idea of the aim. This is the same thing that the author in Hebrews chapter 12 tells us. And I have that up here too, conveniently enough. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So in Hebrews we're told, run with endurance, set your aim on Christ, who himself endured. And how exactly? Why? Why did he endure? Well, it was for the joy set before him. Christ's eyes were fixed on God. His aim was set on the imperishable. So, with our foundational aim set on God, understanding the potential for our growth, understanding the ability for us to be so much more in God, let's get to the how of our spiritual growth. And this leads us back to the idea of self-control. Paul advises us to follow him in this, and we know that we must discipline our minds. We know that we must master our bodies in order to reach our potential, in order to grow spiritually. But that's all easier said than done. We've all resolved at one time or another, and I pray that we continually are resolving to build ourselves up, to grow our faith, to put one block on top of another and to build ourselves up spiritually. Maybe not something as heavy as the 2 refrigerators, maybe something more bearable. One block at a time, we build ourselves up. And we've all succeeded in these changes before, of course. But often these changes can be in vain. We can place a block on our wall, we can set it up there, and surely enough, the integrity begins to fail and it collapses. So why? And as Theo would often say, great question. Thank you for asking. There's a few possibilities, and I've thought about this question, why, throughout the week, and I've come up with three scenarios that encapsulate the possibility of failure in this. The first one is this: our heart may not truly be in it. We may lack the determination to carry out change, and we may not have dominion over ourselves. Our mouth says one thing, but our heart says another. And we know that no one can serve two masters. You can't walk down two roads. Your heart and your mouth, your mind have to be on the same track and of the same mind. In this case, we never give ourselves the chance to succeed. That's the first scenario. That's the first possibility. Second is this: our priorities are inconsistent and they can shift from day to day. Just like building our foundation upon sand, it can be washed away. This is what Paul warns us against in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. And surely enough, I have this up here again. Amazing. That we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro, carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men, and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ. We can never reach our potential with a poorly laid foundation. And just as Paul warns us against here, there are going to be forces that pull us this way and that, and without being firmly rooted, we're susceptible to being pulled any direction. So that's the second scenario. Our priorities are inconsistent. We have no firmly rooted foundation. And I just want to read this bit from Matthew chapter 7, when Christ talks about the foundation that we must have if we were to follow him and if we were to accept his word. That starts in verse 24. He says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Our house, our faith, our aim has to be set on a foundation that is firm, upon the rock. These two scenarios, especially the second one, remind me of the New Age Christianity that is sweeping the nation right now. So much of the youth of America have flocked to these mega churches, these sweet-sounding, instrument-playing, arm's-length Christianity mega churches. And this is displayed in so many of our Bible churches and community churches throughout the country. And I say arm's length because that's exactly where you have to keep the scripture. If you're going to be a member at one of these churches, you have to keep it at arm's length. Don't let that get too close to my life. Don't let it change me. It's not true, and it's not meaningful because, well, I've actually, and I count it a blessing because it's really woken me up to what a problem this is. I have been to Scottsdale Bible Church about a year ago or so. I attended a Sunday evening worship service there. And I'll tell you this, it was nothing less than a concert. A literal concert is what it felt like to me. There was no focus on God. There was no concentration on praising him, on worship. It was what felt good to the kids attending there, what sounded good. They teach acceptance and not accountability. Their desire to please everyone has understandably and inevitably led them to have no clear and concise doctrine. If you want to be baptized, go ahead, be baptized. If you don't want to, that's okay. We don't want to change you. It's really just about acceptance here. It's not about any sort of accountability or changing yourself, molding yourself to Christ, because that's uncomfortable. Let's keep that at arm's length. Their focus is on what sounds good to people and not what pleases God. Now, Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century theologist, a Danish theologian, wrote this in his book Provocations. "The matter is quite simple. The Bible is easy to understand, but we Christians are a bunch of scheming swindlers who pretend to be unable to understand it because we know very well that the minute we understand, we are obliged to act accordingly." That's some harsh criticism, and it's easy to point fingers. That's what the Catholics do. That's what the Calvinists do. But really, there's a piece of us in all of that if we're being honest with ourselves, and I see a piece of myself in there, a reluctance to change. And of course, there's that attachment to the flesh. But we have to work through that. A reluctance to let go, really. Now, the third scenario that I'll walk us through, the third possibility of the why we have failure and attempted growth is this. We may have all the passion and all the desire to improve, and we may do so. We may make that change in our lives. We may say, I can take on more responsibility. I see the opportunity. I see what God's calling me to here. So I'm going to change. I'm going I'm going to become what God wants me to be. And so we set out courageously. We make that change. But the new weight of added responsibility bears down on us. It's heavy, and we become weakened by the relentless work, the load, and it tires us to eventual collapse once again. And I've asked myself this question before: how could I not sustain this? Why could I not sustain this? And again, great question. Thank you for asking. Theo told us high schoolers something about a month back in his class that I haven't forgotten. And it's a pretty simple idea. He said this. He said, we say yes to too much. I know what you're thinking. The first thing that went through my mind is, don't we want to be saying yes to more? Don't we want to be taking every opportunity to grow? That's not at all what he meant. We have to simplify our lives so that we can do more. We cannot be pulled this way and that. We can't be focusing on so much at once and be most efficient in our faith and be most effective in reaching people, in building ourselves up and growing. We need to set our aim on one single goal, which is become like Christ. And then with that simplicity of mind, we may be able to do our work heartily as for the Lord rather than men. Now, to the question, how could we not sustain this third scenario that I'm sure we've all been in, where we courageously make a change in our life? We set out to grow our faith, to build ourselves up in one way or another. And the answer is this: it's the often forgotten element of retreat and reentry, of separation and time of individual growth. Mark 1:35 says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Again, Luke chapter 5, it says, yet the news about him spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Again, a chapter later, it says, one of those days Jesus went off to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he calls his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, who he also designated apostles. Again, in Matthew, and after he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into the mountain apart to pray. And when even was come, he was there alone. And there are numerous examples. And I'm not going to show you all of them because there's so many throughout the Gospels. This is our example. This is the most effective possible way of reaching others, of growing, of building ourselves up. This is the method of recovery that elite athletes partake in. You know, I read something recently when I was researching a few athletes for this sermon that Michael Phelps slept 8 hours a night and took a 2 to 3 hour nap every day. Sounds pretty nice. He did this every single day while he was training, and he didn't miss a day in the pool. I think it said over the course of 3 years he missed 2 to 3 days maybe in the pool. 2 to 3 days of training over 900 days. And he was able to do this through the immense amount of recovery that he gave himself. Now, if we want to be like Christ, should we not also model ourselves in the same fashion that he did, taking time to separate ourselves, to give time to God, to give time to our own individual spiritual maintenance? Separate, understand what we need, pray, be alone, just us and God, not without one of these stupid things by our side. Get that out of there. It's us and God alone, focusing on what we need, not what we want, but what we need spiritually in order to grow, in order to reach our potential, in order to become more. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Our own spiritual growth maintenance and recovery is up to us. The change is up to us individually. Now, a certain man, Raccoon John Smith, who Alex just told me about last week, and I had to research because that's an awesome name. His parents didn't name him Raccoon, sadly. That was just a nickname. He was John Smith. But the name Raccoon John Smith, he was a leader in the Restoration movement in the church in the early 19th century. And as was customary at the time, he didn't get paid for his preaching, so he worked as a farmer to actually make money and then preached on the side. He's the reason that so much of the entire state of Kentucky had the gospel spread to them. He was an effective preacher, to say the least. He grew up a Calvinistic Baptist like his parents, and so when the time came for his maturity in his faith, he sought God in the traditional Calvinistic theory. And so, to make a long story short, after many years of waiting for his call to be one of God's elect, as they so believe, he came to renounce the Baptist faith and embrace the faith of the gospel. And when he broke from Calvinism and put his faith in the gospel of Christ, he was told this by his church: "Your friends will abandon you. You will get nothing for your preaching. Your debts will press you to the earth, and eventually your home will have to be given up." And his reply was this. He said, "Conscience is not an article that I have brought into the market. But if I should offer it for sale, Montgomery County, with all its lands and houses, would not be enough to buy it." That's a man who let nothing get in the way of his faith, who let nothing get in the way of his need for a clean conscience before God. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Now we know in our conscience that we can be more. We ought to be more. And so I want to leave us with this. I want us to focus on the idea of retreat and re-entry, the idea of being alone with God. If we desire to take on more, to build ourselves up, to grow in our faith, to be more like Christ, then let's look at what he did. Let's not forget the time that he took individually to tend to his spiritual needs, to pray, and to be alone with God. This is what I believe is the often forgotten element, the inhibitor of our spiritual growth. But if we focus on it, it can quickly become the catalyst. I don't see why not. Run in such a way that you may win. Run that you may win. Let's remember to become masters over our own body, to discipline ourselves in such a way that we can regiment ourselves, that we can hold ourselves accountable, that we can hold each other accountable, and that we can grow spiritually. And again, that quote from Kierkegaard, I've been thinking about that a lot. It's harsh, but it's true. We know that the faith isn't particularly, the church isn't particularly large in Arizona. I mean, when I read through Acts, I see the effectiveness that Paul had, one single man, upon an entire continent, upon vast amounts of land and people. We can be so much more. There's so much potential within this congregation here, within the people that have not even been touched yet by the gospel. So let's strive for more. Let's run that we may win. Message is rather brief today, but I hope that we can remember this, that we ought to run that we may win.